Thanks for the invitation to speak. I guess this will be very different from maybe your typical RSS talk, because I'm going to talk about the network level and not so much on the robotics, but rather the implications of the robotics on society at large. So I'm going to talk about this need for what I'm going to call a transit-centric way of thinking about mobility. And what I mean here is mass transit, which is slightly different from public transit. It doesn't need to be operated by the public sector. We just need to move masses of people together. I'll try to convince you why. And I'm going to argue that we really should think about this mobility in this way as we move towards autonomous, connected and electrified future. And I'm also going to try to convince you that there are great opportunities for autonomy if we think about it in this way. Okay. So I'm going to actually start with a short video. This is actually some work that was done by people at MIT, including Marco, who gave the first talk in the morning. So this is a simulation they did of trying to figure out what would happen if you replaced all the vehicles in Singapore with autonomous robotaxis, right? So this was about 300,000 autonomous vehicles replacing 800,000 vehicles. On the top left, you have the time. Here is the movement of vehicles. The blue dots are vehicles moving with passengers. Red dots are empty vehicles moving to pick up passengers. These disks, you see, they are proportional to the waiting time for a vehicle to come pick you up. This is roughly the map of Singapore. This is the downtown area. You saw that in the morning commute, people were coming from the suburbs to downtown. And now in the late afternoon, we're going to start seeing the opposite, right? People want to go home. There's going to be cars coming into the downtown core right about now. People are waiting for those rides, getting in those vehicles, and then going back to wherever they need to go back to. And in this simulation, they showed that you can basically serve all of this demand of the 800,000 vehicles with 300,000 cars, autonomous cars, with a wait of about 15 to 20 minutes in the peak periods. Okay. So the question is this a good future? If we ask people to get rid of their personal vehicles and then replace it with about 30–40% of those vehicles that are autonomous and shared in the sense that you acquire the vehicle whenever you want it, is this a good thing? Any thoughts? Is it better? Is it all the same? Is it worse? Yeah?
Waiting for a vehicle, some of the time that people otherwise spend driving a personal vehicle.
So there is some hit in terms of the waiting time. Yeah, that's one observation. Anything else?
It depends on the other constraints under which your system operates, perhaps. If you're very limited on land, like Singapore is for parking, reducing the number of vehicles would be more important than somewhere like the rural US.
Okay, there's the impact of where the vehicles are stored during the day.
There's like a medical emergency, can't wait.
Right. But what if there's a medical emergency, right? So you could have maybe special classes of vehicles for those. So good. Anything else? What about the red dots? If I were to simulate this with your personal vehicles, there's 800,000. Would there be any red dots in the simulation? The red dots were the empty vehicles that were being rebalanced, right? Okay. So the main point that sort of I want to focus on here is this notion of the red dots that are moving to pick up people. So all the other points that were made are valid, but I think the most important thing is the fact that if you drive your own car, you don't have to rebalance it. There's no empty vehicles being moved in the system. You pick up your car, you drive to your location, assuming we have parking, you park it there, right? For each passenger mile travel, the vehicle is traveling about 1 mile. Right? Maybe there's a 5% overhead of parking. But the data from at least the US suggests that if you take a Uber or Lyft type system, that for every vehicle, every mile that you travel, a vehicle is traveling about 1.6 miles. This is a huge network externality that's caused by this, right? And this is going to be, so again, here, this is some data from 2019 where you see the P1 in orange is the amount of miles traveled while the driver is waiting for a passenger request. Okay, so these are vehicles idling around, going to locations where there might be demand. P2 is the amount of miles traveled when the vehicle gets a dispatch notification and goes to pick up the passenger. And P3 is the actual number of miles driven with the passenger on the vehicle. Right? Now, you could argue that in an autonomous system that P1 would decrease because the vehicle wouldn't just drive around looking for people before it gets a dispatching notification. But this is also actually important because the reason P2 is small is that vehicles are locating themselves in areas of high demand. So if we were to reduce P1, P2 would increase, okay? And again, maybe 1.6 is not what's going to happen. It's going to be lower, but this is going to be inevitable. So one of the points I want to make is that ride-hailing systems increase the total miles traveled, so the vehicle miles traveled per passenger mile travel compared to private vehicle ownership. And this can lead to a bunch of negative externalities, right? Congestion, emissions, and even impact on mass transit, because now if the road is congested, then the bus is also slower than before, right? And there's going to also be a number of equity considerations, which we'll try to touch on at the end if we have time. And this can also get even worse if there's competition in the market. So it's worse to have Lyft and Uber operating than just Uber, for example. So I'll take an extreme example to illustrate this. Assume everyone who's going from a city center to the airport takes an Uber, and everyone going from the airport to the city center takes a Lyft. There's a complete imbalance in this demand and supply, right? And of course, this is an artificial construction to exaggerate the point. But even if these things were happening in a more natural way, you will see efficiency loss in the system. Okay, so this is problematic. So the question is, of course, well, what happens when there's autonomy, connectivity, and electrification? Does any of this fundamentally change? So does it? Let's take autonomy, because that's the main topic of today. Does this system being autonomous versus being a traditional Uber Lyft type system change this fundamentally? I'm going to argue not, right? So we'll see later on from Eugene that, in fact, there are, of course, efficiencies that can be gained by running autonomous systems on our highways and cities. However, fundamentally, the notion of rebalancing and the fact that we are moving one person at a time in a vehicle will not fundamentally change regardless of whether it's autonomous. The congestion will remain. The emissions is a question of whether they're electric or not and where the electricity is generated. But you cannot get around the congestion. And in fact, there's going to be large amounts of induced demand because of autonomy, because we're going to sit in this car and be able to watch movies, do work, whatever it is, and we're going to be willing to commute for even longer distances, right? So this is going to be potentially really problematic from a societal point of view. Now, of course, the technology itself is not the issue here. It's how the technology has been deployed. Obviously, things like ride-hailing are a huge improvement over taxis, and there are lots of benefits like the reduction in accidents due to drunk driving and such. So the technology is good. The question is, how do we use it in a way that's more valuable to society? And of course, a natural thing one can do is, well, why put one person at a time in a vehicle? You can share, right? The notion of like an Uber pool. And this, has been tried out in many US cities. So in the US, it's called microtransit, where you use these kinds of shuttles to move people from origin to destination, end-to-end trips, or to connect to transit hubs through first last mile connections. So this is a shuttle from Arlington, Texas, where they don't have a traditional public transit system. They just have this shared on-demand shuttle system operated by a company called VIA. There's a few others. Sorry, that's from Arlington. This is from King County Metro in the Seattle area, and a few such examples. Now, this kind of system exists, and we have the technology. We have the technology to do this at scale. And to illustrate that, I'm going to show you an example of trying to run this kind of high-capacity microtransit at the scale of New York City. So in New York City, the yellow taxi system, on a given day, there are roughly 400 to 450,000 trips that are happening. And at any given time, there are about 2,000 active trips. And these are typically served by about 13,500 taxis. Now, the question is, what would happen if we replace these taxis with some kind of shared mode, right? What kind of benefits could we have, okay? So this is just a quick example. So here, the picture of the videos, the color of the dots that are moving indicate the number of people on board. There are three examples here. There are 2,000 vehicles here with capacity 1. That's a typical taxi system. Here's a capacity 4 setup where you can think about it as an Uber pool, where 4 different individuals can ride together with different origins and destinations. And here is more like a van, minivan or shuttle that can accommodate 10 passengers, right? So just play this one more time. And here you have some statistics. On the top left, you see the service rate, the average waiting time, average in-car delay, and so on and so forth. And just to compare this, so what happens here is that you can see that as the vehicle capacity is increasing, even with the same number of vehicles, you can obviously serve more people as you have more seats, right? Because even though the number of vehicles is the same, the capacity of the system is greater when you have more seats in the system. And the waiting time is decreasing. So even though you're sharing a ride with someone else, the time you wait to get a vehicle is decreasing because, again, there are more seats in the system. The capacity of the system is larger. But if you look at the in-car delay, it is increasing because if you're taking a taxi system, you go from your origin to your destination directly. You don't have to share with anyone, right? So there's no in-car delay. However, if you take a shared system, when you keep sharing with more and more people, there's more delay that's induced. But perhaps most importantly, what you see is the travel distance in each of these systems. The capacity 10 system, each vehicle is traveling fewer kilometers than the capacity 1 system. So here, the vehicle is traveling roughly 330 kilometers, but serving 97% of the demand. Whereas here, it's traveling 380 kilometers, but serving only 50% of the demand. Right? So this kind of illustrates the power of sharing and the fact that we can actually do these things at real time. So this kind of system is computing the trajectories of these 2,000 vehicles in real time as the vehicles are moving. And you would have seen these 2 sample trajectories that were being plotted. These are the vehicle routes being changed dynamically every 30 seconds based on the current load of demand in the system. Okay. So we have the technology right now to do this at scale. But what are the issues here? So at least in the US, many cities have tried to deploy these systems. Again, these so-called microtransit systems. There's been a lot of funding from the US DOT, and NSF, and Department of Energy to try these things out. But they've been mostly small publicly funded deployments. So part of the problem is getting people to change their behavior. Right? So if you talk to a transit agency, they will not want to even run a pilot unless it's going to be for at least 1 year. Because if you do something for 6 months, by the time the people in the city know that the service is operational, it'll be time to shut it down and nobody's going to change their behavior for something that's such short term. Even if it's a year, you're not going to get someone to get rid of their car for something that's short term. So that's been a big challenge, practically speaking. And there've been mostly ad hoc things where you get money for a project to run maybe 3 or 4 shuttles in some region of the city. And it's generally poorly integrated with the larger ecosystem of the transit system in that region. And finally, again, maybe the most important thing is that the labor cost does not scale with the vehicle. So if you think about a 40-seater or 50-seater bus, the driver is about 60 to 70% of the operating cost. So you can't replace a 50-seater bus with 10 4-seater vehicles or 5 10-seater shuttles, right? It doesn't scale that way. And again, the value of sharing is further diminished by the way that we charge people for using the infrastructure or the road network, because it's really cheap to drive your own car. And if you were to, for example, if you're Uber trying to promote Uber Pool, the savings for the system by sharing is so small that it can't offer you that much of a discount. So what you'll get is maybe a $12 trip to do a Uber X and a $9 trip or $10 trip to do a Uber Pool. And it's really hard to get people to change their behavior for a small discount for pooling. However, if there was congestion pricing, this would change that dynamic, right? Because then it would be more expensive to take a trip alone, and that would promote more sharing. So one of the takeaways here is, things like autonomous vehicles. So I think autonomous vehicles have a huge role to play in transit because it really changed the unit economics of how things work. If we had autonomous shuttles, we can replace the 50-seater bus with a bunch of smaller shuttles. And that's what's really necessary to build this kind of system in an economically viable way. And also, we need better regulation. We need regulation that makes it more expensive to drive your own car and properly charge the externality of driving your own car. Okay. So that's kind of where we are at today. What I want to talk about is sort of the next step. So if we really want to, from the ground up, design how we move people in cities, how should we think about it? And I'm going to argue for this idea of a fully integrated multimodal mass transit system. And I'm going to talk about buses in the context of buses specifically, because that's a part of infrastructure that we can reconfigure. We can't reconfigure a train system that exists today. We can't reconfigure the metro, but we can flip the switch and completely reconfigure our bus network if we wanted to, right? Okay, so let's talk about what this means. So a multimodal transit system, you can envision it in the following way. There's some traditional fixed line transit system, some kind of backbone of high frequency vehicles with higher capacity, moving people in high density corridors, complemented with some other suite of services. That could be ride hailing, ride pooling, micromobility, microtransit, take your pick. And these could move people end to end and also work as first last mile connectors. Okay. And the question is, well, how would we design something like this in the context of thinking about energy efficiency, the network externalities, so things like congestion and equity, which again, I will touch upon at the end. Okay. So that's the goal. So I'm going to try to quickly give you a sense of modeling this kind of question and how difficult it is to actually solve this. So I'm hoping to convince you that these kind of problems are important, they're interesting, and also technically difficult. So hopefully some of you would think about tackling these. Okay, so again, now to make things more concrete, we'll talk about the setting where there's a bus network along with some kind of taxi type system that is dynamic. So a static component and a dynamic component that has to be planned in conjunction. So we can ask a few different kinds of questions in this context. So the first thing is, does demand responsive service make any sense? Right? Now, the value of having a dynamic component on top of static component depends on many factors. It depends on the OD distribution in the city. If everyone lives on a line that's going back and forth, we don't need anything dynamic, right? Of course, our cities are much more complex. But the value of this sort of dynamism is a function of the OD distribution in the city. It's a function of the network topology. It's a function of behavioral considerations. And it's also dependent on the relative costs of these different kinds of services. So you can think about doing high-level back-of-the-envelope calculations about the viability of dynamic service. The next kind of set of questions we can ask is, well, how do you efficiently operate the on-demand component? I'm going to argue that that's the part that we know really well how to do. We have companies like Uber and Lyft operating taxis for a long time, and this has been studied really deeply by the OR community. And even in the setting of high-capacity shuttles, we have good technology, like I argued through the video that we were looking at earlier. The hardest part of all of this is the question of how do we do the whole end-to-end planning? And the first piece of that is, well, what route should be part of this fixed backbone if it is part of a multimodal system, right? That includes a dynamic component, but you need to now plan for this backbone, and you need to design this backbone. And this is sort of in the context of just looking at this problem alone, without being in conjunction with this on-demand component, is already a very hard problem in the operations research community. So let's talk about that and then jump into the multimodal aspect. So this problem is called the line planning problem. Okay, so the goal here is, given some origin-destination matrix of where people want to go, I want to find a set of bus routes and their corresponding frequencies so that I can serve as many people as possible given some budget constraint. The transit agency has so many dollars. They want to come up with this network of buses that would move as many people as possible subject to this budget constraint. Okay, so here's the model. So there's a set of buses. They have some capacity C. A bus operates at some frequency F, let's say 5 times an hour. So every 12 minutes, a bus is coming. And a bus line is defined to be a combination of a route R and a frequency F. So this blue route operating every 12 minutes is one line. The blue route operating every 10 minutes, that's a different line, okay, and under this definition of a line. So the goal is to choose a set of lines and the assignment of passengers to lines that maximize ridership. There's some standard constraints. We have some budget B, like I said, that's the transit agency's budget, and at most C passengers on any edge used by a bus route at any given time. We're going to make some modeling assumptions here to get some nice theoretical results, and then I will relax them. We're going to assume no interbus transfers, okay, for now. Okay, so here's the model. There's a decision variable XLP, which is asking, do I assign passenger P to line L? Okay, And there's a value of assigning passenger P to line L, which is pre-computed. If you want to maximize ridership, the value is 1. If passenger P can take line L, it's 0 otherwise. Okay? And whether I can take that line depends on how far that line is to my origin and destination. Right? Okay. And the multimodal setting, you can think about that, about the savings of passenger P using line L. Okay? Now, the second decision variable is, do I open line L? Right? So there are many potential bus lines to choose from. And for each one of those, I had to ask the question, well, do I open that one? And if I open a specific line, I had to pay the cost for opening that line. And the sum of all the lines that I open should be less than my budget constraint. And there's this other constraint here that's basically saying I cannot violate the capacity constraint on each edge. The bus is 50 seats, no more than 50 people can be on the bus at any given time. And then finally, you can't assign one person to 2 different bus lines and get twice the credit. Okay? That's the model. That's the entire model. It's a very simple problem to formulate. Now, it turns out that it's very hard to solve this problem because there are exponentially many potential bus lines to pick from. There are exponential number of paths in a network. So what's typically done is in the OR community in these kinds of problems is you generate these lines on the fly by solving another optimization problem. So this is typically called column generation, branch and price in the case of integer programs. But it turns out that in this particular problem, the so-called pricing problem that you need to solve to dynamically generate these bus lines is extremely hard to solve. In fact, there is a hardness of approximation results even for doing this exactly in general cases. So this is very hard to do, and in practice, people have tried to come up with solutions for this, but the scalability of applying this kind of approach is very limited. You cannot at this point do it at the urban scale. So what's done in practice commonly is to assume a set of candidate lines. Yeah, so you look at the lines that are currently in the city, you have some data-driven techniques to generate new lines, you ask experts in the community to give you lines, and you generate a pool of lines. Let's say you have 5,000 potential lines you can choose from. And then you solve another optimization problem to pick the best 20 or 30 that satisfy the budget constraint from that large set that you've generated. Okay. Turns out that that is also still a hard problem because it turns out that this is an integer linear program with a very bad LP relaxation, which means that if you give it to a traditional solver like Gurobi or Cplex, it'll take a long time to give the answer. And what's even worse is that if you don't have lines that were carefully constructed to be good, and you're using a pool that's generated through other means, you would need a big pool of lines to make sure you have some good lines in there. You can't start with 200 lines. You need to start with 5,000 lines. And of course, that makes the ILP even bigger and even slower to solve. Yeah? Okay. And when you say slow to solve, these are planning problems. So they don't necessarily need to be solved in seconds, but these things can take sometimes days to solve if you don't do it right. Okay? So it's bad. Okay. So what can we do here? If you look at this problem, so if you're someone in the operations research community, you see this problem, you'll see that it's very similar to the well-known capacitated facility location problem, where there's some very nice results in approximation algorithms showing that you can use this notion of submodularity, which is a notion of diminishing returns, to get nice theoretical results. However, it turns out that in this particular problem, because the capacity constraint here is at the edge level, right? A 50-seater bus can move 300 people, but just not more than 50 between each bus stop. That actually breaks all the nice properties you have when you're solving capacitative facility location, so it doesn't work out. However, if you change this problem and use another very common technique in the OR community, which is to come up with an extended formulation. So instead of deciding whether I should assign passenger P to line L, I can ask the question of, do I assign the set of passengers S to line L? This problem turns out to be the LP relaxation of this integer program turns out to be a much better relaxation. And then you can use standard techniques much better. However, there are exponentially many sets of people that you can create from a group of people, right? If you think of all the subsets of people, that's exponential. So now I've taken a problem that is in a polynomially sized and written another problem, which I say is a better problem, but is much, much larger. However, we can again go back to this idea of column generation. and create these sets, the good sets, very, very efficiently. So unlike the pricing problem for deciding lines, the pricing problem for deciding the sets of people turns out to be, fortunately, much, much easier to solve. Okay? And once we do that, then we can use standard techniques from what's called randomized rounding and actually solve this problem very efficiently. So I'm going to sort of just jump into what this means, what efficiently means. What efficiently means is that we can get a solution that is provably within 1 minus 1 over E, which is about 63% of the optimal solution. And of course, this is the worst case guarantee. In practice, these solutions tend to be about within the gap between the integer program and the linear programming relaxation turns out to be like 10%. So it's 90%. And that doesn't mean it's 10% from optimal. It just means 10% from the relaxation, which means we don't really know how much, but presumably much smaller. And since this is a randomized technique, of course, the problem is only budget respecting with high probability. And you can quantify this through a concentration result. But you can also tweak this epsilon to decide, you can reduce the budget artificially to increase the probability of satisfying the budget. And another thing that you can do is, because this is, you solve LP and then flip coins to do the randomized rounding, you can do the randomized rounding 10,000 times if you want. It's very, very fast. And what you get is a family of solutions that lie on a trade-off curve between budget violation and number of people served. So then you can pick your favorite point on that curve. And that can also be done very, very fast. Okay. So, so now let's talk about sort of the practice, right? That's the theory. That's what we can show in theory for a system where we assume no interbus transfers, access to a set of candidate lines, and on-demand service exogenous. And I'll talk a little bit about this as well. Now, in practice, we would like to relax all of these things because in the real world, we want to do bus-to-bus transfers. The fact that it's hard to generate candidate sets of lines would be a reason to believe that doing that exogenously isn't going to give us good lines. And if we were able to get good lines without thinking about the optimization problem we are solving, well, then it wouldn't be hard to do. So we have to actually take some information from this problem when generating the lines. And then this notion of the on-demand service being exogenous is also problematic because the cost of serving a particular trip through a Uber-type service depends on who else is being served. Right? So if I'm taking you to the airport, the cost for me to take you to the airport depends on whether there's another trip from the airport coming back. Right? So this is not exogenous. It's an endogenous problem. The cost of the on-demand system is endogenous. So what we're working on now, and this is really ongoing work, is this idea of relaxing this access to a candidate set of line and relaxing the cost being exogenous. The interbus transfers I'm not going to show right now, but that is also can be done using this kind of approach. And the general idea here is, and I'm going to go very quickly, just completely ignore the model description here. The two things that are important is that one is that we include constraints that relate to taxi circulation. So that is, we're trying to understand what is the cost of this on-demand component on the design of, how the design of the bus lines impact the cost of the on-demand component. Because depending on how many people need to be moved through the on-demand system, we have to account for the rebalancing cost. And these constraints account for the rebalancing cost. The second thing is to relax this idea of having candidate sets of lines. And we're going to go back to this idea of generating lines through column generation. And I said earlier that this was very hard to do at scale. And this is still true. But what we're trying to do here is to not try to solve that problem exactly, but to solve some kind of relaxation of that problem. Again, there's hardness of approximation results to solve that exactly. So we cannot do that in a tractable way. However, it's better to get some information from the underlying LP than to completely ignore it. So the game here is to try to see what is the maximum amount of information you can extract from this optimization problem in a computationally tractable manner. And our early results show that we can do this again for now larger scale networks. So the state of the art so for example, our paper from a couple of years ago was networks of about 30 bus nodes. Okay, and our goal is to try to extend this for the scale of 100 bus nodes and 1,000 edges and an on-demand system that's fairly comprehensive. And what we can show is that if you use this kind of column generation idea compared to some candidate set of lines, that you can, in some of these test cases, and this is a test case based on Boston, that you can almost halve the cost of serving the same number of people. And in the interest of time, I'm going to just jump over this so I can talk a bit about this question of fairness as well. So what is this notion of fairness in transit design? So if you had a city where these dots here, these gray dots are points of demand, origin and destination demand, and you had 18 buses. If you wanted to maximize ridership, you would run those buses on these two high-density corridors. However, if you want to maximize coverage and be quote-unquote fair to the community, you would run them all over the city. Right? Now you can clearly see what's happening here. Here, there's high-quality service. Buses are coming at high frequency, but people here are getting no service. Here, everyone gets some service, but everyone gets crappy service. Right? And maybe fewer people actually use the system. And there are a lot of people here who could use it, but don't use it. So there's a trade-off here. Here's a more concrete example from one of our collaborators in Chattanooga. So they have this case where they have different census areas with different demographics. So Bob lives in a census tract 16. It's a low-income opportunity zone. Bob wants to get to work, but has no car, so must take the bus. Sally lives in census tract 7. It's a high-income area. She is 15 minutes away from downtown, owns a car, but can also take public transit. Right? So it has the option of driving on. So do you treat them individually? You treat them identically, or do you treat them differently when you plan your system? Right? So what you can do is, again, in these kinds of frameworks, you can actually, by tweaking, for example, the objective function, figure out how to treat people differently and prioritize people in certain demographic groups or geographic regions. However, these things are really, there are many, many reasonable definitions of fairness, right? And what we really want to do here, it's going to correspond to different societal goals and priorities. So each community might have its own goals. And this reads different mathematical models and solution strategies. So that's one thing I want to highlight. And if we go back to this kind of high-level thinking again, I want to sort of emphasize that sustainable, efficient, and equitable personal mobility cannot exist without a fundamental focus on mass transit. I hope I've been able to give you some intuition into this claim and convince you that this is true. And developing multimodal transit systems that address this will require new technology, business models, and public policy. Okay? And finally, opportunities for autonomy and connectivity and electrification to play a greater role. So personally, I think the biggest role for autonomy to play in the shorter next 10 years would be if we can put a lot of energy into autonomous transit systems. I hope anyone from Waymo or Cruise and the other AV providers and people doing research on the vehicles really think about the autonomous transit vehicle. And I think there's huge opportunities there. There's a huge amount of work to be done. There are interesting questions. There are important questions societally. So I will conclude with that and thank all the funding agencies, partners, and collaborators. Thank you.
Thanks for the great talk. I think one of the things you mentioned throughout the talk is that some of these hybrid things are contingent on cities having a particular distribution of OV pairs such that they're not, aligned. Are there cities that are kind of well known to have the kind of type of OV setup such that these hybrid approaches are the right thing to do?
That's a great question. I don't think there is a careful and comprehensive research on that question yet. But most cities, I think, are somewhere in the middle of the spectrum, right? No city is completely, it works just with buses. No city is completely the other extreme. If you take Manhattan, for example, it's one where there's very high density. So it comes down to density, spatio-temporal density. The backbone works well when you have a lot of people going in the same corridor at the same time. So the general idea is cities that are more suburban and where there is more sprawl, you cannot move people just through the backbone. And moving people through the on-demand system doesn't come for free either. The more sprawl there is, the more expensive that is as well, right? So at the end of the day, you had to sort of decide for the more density there is, the better. But if you want to serve all the people, the goal is to still serve them more efficiently than with the individual vehicle. However, there will be some cases in which you cannot beat that person having a car for that trip. And again, in an AV future, those are going to be trips that are going to be served by AV serving a single person. In Oslo, the public transit agency, is actually, they want to have 30,000 autonomous vehicles in their public transit system. Their goal is to make sure that the public transit system can serve every personal mobility trip people in Oslo have without having to own a car. And that will require, in some cases, giving them a personal trip from A to B.
I was wondering, for the sake of connecting the
Yeah.
1 and 3, I wonder if you can reflect or suggest how might these optimization problems look different for when considering autonomy to encourage, say, the folks working on the
Right.
eco level vehicle. How might the problems that are posed today look different from a transit, autonomous transit perspective?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I guess there are implications at a few different levels there too. So first of all, there's things like, well, where there might be certain roads that are faster to travel on. So you can, when you're optimizing these systems, you can embed the constraints that correspond to the individual vehicle. So certain vehicles of certain sizes might be able to go on certain roads. You can think about the energy cost of driving on certain roadways if that's a consideration. So I think part of that discussion that would be really nice to have is to work with people in the community to identify what are the important things for the vehicle itself and how does it. So it could be any of the things that are in the objective: speed, access to the different roads and the different costs of those. To some extent, so with things like systems like paratransit, the more elderly community involved in that, so more of elderly, so people's behavioral questions about how people feel about the vehicle. Yeah, but this is I don't have a comprehensive answer, but I think this is part of the conversation that needs to be had. We are running a project and just started in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where we'll run 4 autonomous shuttles in 2 years. And we're starting to ask these questions with the AV provider. What are the things that are going to impact our high-level planning? And of course, the obvious thing is which roads can the vehicle go at which speed? Uh-oh.
Changing the frequency of buses or like changing the capacity of buses all the time.
What was the capacity of? Yeah, the frequency is baked into the problem because the frequency is important because it captures capacity as well. So our operating model for the backbone is that you have to have a minimum frequency. Otherwise, people won't take it. It can change through the, yeah. So you can have, these are static models, but you can have the morning commute, rush hour schedule, the off commute. And if you are a private company that doesn't have to publish the bus schedule, you can even every 15 minutes change your backbone. Let's say it's Uber Bus and Uber X. People don't need to know what the Uber bus schedule is, right? So every 15 minutes, you can change the backbone. And that's the importance of computing things fast. Right? So if it takes days to compute, you can't change it every 15 minutes. But yeah. Okay. I think I'm well out of time, so thank you.